Hello YouTube. So a subscriber of mine called A Bit of the Universe posted a very, very long series of comments on one of my videos, and I want to address some of the points within it because I feel like a lot of energy clearly went into posting this series of comments, and a lot of thought went into posting this series of comments, and because of that, I think it deserves response. But at the same time, I think it's probably better to do it in video form than in a comment form. So I'll just claim this as a norm. If you have, if you write, a whole bunch of comments to me that I find interesting enough, I will do my best to respond to them in a video form. So what he asked me about initially, and I think I did misinterpret him, but what he asked me about initially was, do you know of any philosophers who talk about the future? And to which I pointed him to Marx and Hegel. And he replied along the lines of, I tried to shoot this video once, actually reading through his comment, but it ended up being very, very long, and I don't want to try and... I don't think there's any reason to make this video as, 40 minutes long or something. So I pointed him to Marx and Hegel, and he said, I find that stuff interesting, but, I'm talking more on, seems like he's talking much more on vast timescales, trillions of years into the future, that kind of thing, as well as the philosophical implications of 4.5 billion years of or 13.7 billion years in the past, 4 billion years of life, right? And specifically talking about biology, right? The fact that we are biological organisms. One thing that I can say is that there is such a thing as the philosophy of biology, and that I'm not. There is such a thing. I'm not the guy to talk about it. I simply don't know enough about it. But I'd imagine from there you could probably tease out interesting things for this project that you're undertaking, right? Thinking about biology a trillion years into the future or something like that. The best that I think I can do is to critique the project that you're undertaking. And the reason that's the best I can do is because a good critique, right? What it does is it forces you to see the roadblocks in your way, and it forces you to distill your thoughts a little bit more. It's probably the best I can do about these subjects. Now, let's talk about the past first of all, because you ask about the philosophical implications about living in this very old, ancient universe. And there are two things to say about that. First of all, I'd point to Derrida, who has a really interesting critique of Levi-Strauss, and it's all very boring, right? But he does make this interesting point where he says, Levi-Strauss, you are assuming this distinction between nature and culture, and you're assuming that nature comes first, culture comes later. What Derrida tries to do is to say, no, culture has to come first. Sounds crazy, but let's see if I can unpack what he means by that in some cogent fashion. The idea is that what what nature is a concept. When we talk about nature, we're talking about ideas about nature rather than the thing itself. When we talk about natural law or something, we're talking about mathematical distillations of patterns in nature or something like that. The point is that there's no way to talk about this without referring to symbol systems of one way or another. As such, nature as a category is meaningless. And I mean that word in its most refined sense. Meaning, like, has no meaning, not some pejorative sense. Nature is meaningless without culture. Culture is that which imbues nature with meaning, or plucks things from nature and puts them in, arranges them in different orders and understands things, right? Apprehends things over time. And that process of understanding is that which gives nature as a category meaning. It's what makes it meaningful to talk about. That is to say, if there were, how could I describe this? If there was some natural phenomena way out in space that no one had ever observed, how could we talk about it, right? Not just that no one had ever observed, but none of our models predicted it either, right? We couldn't talk about such a thing because we haven't developed the symbols to go around it, right? So we can talk about black holes, and the reason why is that we've developed a whole symbol system around black holes, various mathematical equations, various sort of popularizing thought experiments, sort of. We have words like the event horizon of a black hole. We have words like the singularity, right? We have a language around black holes that allow us to talk about black holes. And that's what makes it meaningful to talk about black holes. But in the absence of that, we can't talk because the symbols aren't there, right? So in this sense, nature doesn't exist without culture. Now, tie this to the radical past, right? When I say radical past, I mean pre-human past. The past without symbols. Well, what are we really talking about when we're talking about the past? What we're talking about is a symbol system that exists in the present. We're talking about a model of the past, right? So when we talk about 13.7 billion years and the Big Bang and all of this, obviously that is not present. All we have in the present is a model of what that looks like. And that model is purely virtual. And I mean the word virtual in the classic philosophical sense. That is to say, something that is virtual is something that's kept alive by discourse, rather than something that's actual. The distinction is between the virtual and the actual. So something that might be considered virtual would be money. Money is something that's virtual. It's kept alive by our constant discourse about money, rather than some actuality that money is. Now, the radical past is something that's purely virtual. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? I'm not, like, downgrading science in some sense. But we have to understand it when we're talking philosophically, I think. We have to understand that it is something virtual. It's a virtual model of the past that actually exists in the present, right? And that model forms a kind of background in which we conceive of ourselves. So, in different times, you had different models of the past. In the medieval period, nature is something that is hierarchically organized, God at the top, man just below it, and then all the way down to minerals, right? There's a sort of hierarchy of being, and because the universe is constituted subjectively, that is by God, you can have things like quote-unquote objective values that are sort of inscribed into being itself. Goodness, right? The good as such, to use Nietzsche's term. Goodness is something that's a part of the universe rather than a part of the mind. The only way that makes sense is that if you have a large subject, right, God. The only way that makes sense is if a subject is sustaining the universe. And so we have two very different pictures. We have what I'll call roughly the medieval picture versus the contemporary picture, where nature becomes this vast expanse of space, and we lose the idea of objective beauty and objective value. All that stuff becomes conceived of as being in here, right? We see with this picture of the world, we see a very different way of conceiving of ourselves, right? That's what's philosophically interesting about these two different models of the past. Further, that's what's philosophically interesting about talking about the Big Bang or something. Is not so much its factuality, not so much whether or not it happened, right? That's a scientific question. The philosophical question, I think, is something like, given that we're defining ourselves with this as the background, what does that mean for us today, right? What does that mean for humanity, right? So that's important, right? I think that when we talk about the philosophy of, again, the quote-unquote radical past, I think the philosopher is prepared to take this as something that is virtual and discursive, which it is, right? It also might be the case that it happened, right? Which is, I think, how the scientists would take it. These are not mutually exclusive, right? They're just two different pictures of what we're doing when we're doing science. So yeah, the virtuality of the past is something that you need to take into account. But this also means that any discussion about the radical future is therefore also purely virtual. It's a model of the future that we are constructing in the present, right? And it's not so much, any construction about the future doesn't tell us so much about the future. What it tells us about, again, philosophically speaking, is us here and now. This is why the best sci-fi is usually conceived of as being something allegorical, right? There's a lesson in it for us now. Now, I would say that there's a Hegelian problem with conceiving of the radical future as well, conceiving of a trillion years in the future or something. And actually, it's probably better conceived of as a Marxian problem, but Hegel thought of it first. The idea being that our world and our society, the sort of cultural structure of our world and our society, defines how we think about the world. It defines the kinds of models that we can propose about the world. So, for Marx, this all comes down to relations of production. So for Marx, if capitalism were to collapse, our picture of the world would change radically. And I think there's something very true about that. I think that with the rise, it's a very plausible thing to point out that, the rise of the bourgeois class, brings about the rise of the Enlightenment, and it brings about a certain way of thinking about the world, right? And the shift from slave societies to feudal societies changed the picture of the world wherein we were operating. So, assuming that our social relations that we are thoroughly embedded in are contingent, and assuming that they can change to some other form that's hitherto unimagined, then my conception of the radical future is going to tell me more about the social relations within which I am embedded than it is going to about the future. And the person in another social organization, the same is true about them. Right. So that is to say, what I'm skeptical about here is that I'm skeptical that you can talk about the future at all, actually. But this is particularly true when you're talking about even 100 years in the future, much less a trillion, or some billion. I think that either that project requires a disavowal of the fact that I am an agent that is formed by present social relations. I'm an agent that operates within a society that has a history. I am an agent that operates within a nexus of intersubjective social forces, right? So it either entails the disavowal of that, or such a project is carried out to be the inversion, I guess you could say, of what Foucault called, I am writing a history of the present, right? So when Foucault talks about his histories, he says, I'm not trying to write a history of the past, I'm trying to write a history of the present, right? You can imagine that distinction. Now, the only way that I can imagine thinking about the future at these incredible timescales, is through thinking about the future of the present rather than the future of the future, right? Rather than trying to come to any sort of objective conclusions about what the however many billion years in the future, what that's going to look like. Now, I think in that latter sense, it may be a really interesting project. So, for instance, and we mentioned Kurzweil in our exchange, right? Kurzweil, if you take him seriously, seems to think that if life is going to exist in a billion years, it will literally be us, like me and you, right? Due to things like mind uploading and full brain virtualization and all sorts of stuff like this, radical life extension, right? If Kurzweil's right, it's interesting to think that we might be having this conversation in a billion years. You know what I mean? I like that idea very much. I think it's not so much out of a fear of death or something. I just think there's something really aesthetic about that, right? There's something really aesthetic about the idea that in a short period of time, human beings went to a life expectancy of 80-something to a life expectancy of indefinite. I think that would be a nice aesthetic thing to see. But again, I mean, I feel like, and I'm at liberty to say this because I'm not a scientist, but I think a scientist would agree And I think this would maybe a dangerous thing to say in light of the creation evolution conversation that's happening on YouTube. But I think someone who's very scientific would be prepared to say that, in 200 years, our picture of the world is going to be very different. How that picture of the world, I can't predict what that picture of the world is going to be. Again, because I am enmeshed in a certain socio-cultural reality that I can't step outside of that. So I have no idea what the world is how people are going to think about the world in 200 years. But what I will say is that it's very likely that however they think about the world is going to inform how they think about themselves. And that's even more true in the lifespan of the universe. This is all barring, of course, the potential for ecological catastrophe or something like that. Now, so yeah, this is a reason to be. What I would say is that taking this thought of a billion years into the future, which is a fascinating and really, really interesting thought. If you take on the project of thinking about such a thing, it has to be taken on with the knowledge that it is naive to think that you can actually get at what that's going to look like, for the reasons that I think I've articulated. It doesn't mean it's not a useful project. I mean, science fiction authors do this all the time. But again, that's a future of the present, right? That's what I think is going on there. Now, what you could imagine, I think, or where it could be useful to think about things this way, is to think of this picture of the world that's very vast in the past and the future. And so, like Carl Sagan has the whole pale blue dot thing. We're just this tiny little dot in the world. Which is a statement about the philosophical implications about the vastness of our universe. Every war that's ever happened has happened on this tiny little speck, right? That's a statement about the philosophical implications of such a vast universe, but that's in space, right? But I could imagine thinking through the vastness of the past and the future, and thinking through our place in that now, and coming to some interesting conclusions about what's implied by that. What picture of ourselves is implied by that picture of nature. I think such a thing can be done. But yeah, that's pretty much the best answer I can give you. Now, I don't know, again, pointing to specific philosophers, I think Baudrillard might be of interest to you. He doesn't talk about the radical future in this way, but he is someone who talks about the advance of technology and the effects that has on culture very extensively. And I mean, I suppose you could extrapolate that kind of thing out far. Other than that, I think philosophers are wary to have that kind of conversation for the reasons that I've articulated, right? Um, it might be thought of as a naive thing to do. And how do you do that also without constructing a grand narrative of history? That's kind of the question. Um, and yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say on the subject. Uh, but interesting questions, and I hope that you watch this and are satisfied at some level. Have a good day.